The Lancaster bomber looked like it should have been an easy target. That is what Luftwaffe pilots told themselves when they first saw it in early 1942. Headman Wilhelm Jonan, a decorated night fighter ace, recalled his first impression in interviews after the war. "We nicknamed it the Fliegende Scheune, the flying barn, because it looked like wings bolted onto a farmer's shed." The name was not kind. It was contempt, almost pity. This bomber was so massive, so oddly proportioned, that it seemed to announce its own weakness against the dark European sky. The Lancaster stretched 69 feet long, with wings spanning 102 feet, tip to tip. Set it beside the American B-17 Flying Fortress, itself no small aircraft, and the Lancaster was actually 4 feet longer with a broader span. But raw measurements alone didn't earn the barn comparison. The fuselage measured 7 feet across at the widest point, giving a boxy silhouette that lacked the smooth, streamlined look of other bombers. To German radar operators and visual spotters, that outline shouted easy prey, a slow target painted against the night. What really fixed the barn label was the greenhouse-style cockpit. The flight deck carried extensive perspex glazing wrapped around the pilot and flight engineer stations, creating huge reflective surfaces. On moonlit nights, or when searchlights touched them, those panels shone like lit barn windows. Luftwaffe pilot Heinz Röcker remembered. You could see them from 5 kilometers in the right conditions. The canopy would catch light, and suddenly you had a perfect marker. But wartime nicknames carry a dangerous irony, and this one would be treacherous for anyone who believed it. By March of 1942, when RAF Bomber Command first used Lancasters operationally against the German battleship Tirpitz, the aircraft had already begun to contradict its comic label. The Augsburg raid that followed on April 17, 1942, sent 12 Lancasters in broad daylight at rooftop height across occupied France. 7 never came back, but the 5 that reached the target delivered with brutal precision. That was not barn-like. That was aggression that bordered on suicidal courage. The psychology behind the nickname reveals something crucial about how the Luftwaffe first underestimated British heavy bomber progress. German intelligence knew the limits of earlier RAF types. The underpowered Hamptons, the cramped Wellingtons, the troubled Manchesters. When the Lancaster appeared as an evolution of the failed Manchester, analysts assumed it would inherit the same flaws. They catalogued dimensions, but missed the revolutionary engineering beneath that barn-like skin. The name spread through Luftwaffe squadrons across occupied Europe at remarkable speed. By summer of 1942, interception reports routinely used Scheune as shorthand for Lancaster contacts. Night fighter crews radioed positions with phrases like Scheune formation heading northeast. The term embedded so deeply that it entered official tactical assessments. One document from Nachtjagdgeschwader 1 in August 1942 described Lancaster formations as large, slow-moving targets presenting favorable engagement profiles. That judgment would age badly. What the barn nickname missed was purpose. Yes, the Lancaster was enormous. It had to be. That cavernous bomb bay, 33 feet long down the fuselage centerline, with no internal obstructions, could swallow payloads that physically would not fit inside B-17s or B-24s. The very features that looked agricultural were ruthless design choices, prioritizing destructive capacity over beauty. Every square foot of that barn-like volume served payload delivery. The irony deepened through 1942 as Lancaster squadrons multiplied across Bomber Command. By year's end, the RAF had more than 200 operational Lancasters, and German night fighter pilots noticed something unsettling. These barns kept coming back. They absorbed damage that should have killed them, held formation through flak that shredded other bombers, and their crews showed a persistence that turned mockery into worry. The nickname stayed. The laughter died somewhere over the roar. 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines defined the Lancaster beyond mere propulsion. Each produced 1,280 horsepower at takeoff, for a combined punch of just over 5,120 horses, dragging 65,000 pounds into hostile airspace. The Germans had nothing comparable in their own bomber fleet. The Heinkel He 177 fought chronic engine fires, and most Luftwaffe bombers relied on twins that could not touch Lancaster payloads. This 4-engine layout was not just power, it was insurance. Oberleutnant Martin Becker, flying Bf 110 night fighters from Leeuwarden in Holland, logged a March 1943 engagement that captured the Merlin advantage perfectly. His combat report described pumping 20mm cannon shells into a Lancaster's port-outer engine until it flamed out and the propeller feathered. The Lancaster did not descend. It did not even break formation. The British simply continued, as though we had inconvenienced them rather than crippled them, Becker wrote. On 3 engines, they kept altitude and speed enough to reach the target. We disengaged for fuel, knowing they would likely bomb and get home. The mathematics of 4-engine survivability haunted Luftwaffe planning through 1943. A Lancaster could, in theory, limp on 2, barely. But more importantly, it could fight and navigate on 3, holding roughly 160 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. German twin-engine bombers, by contrast, became death traps after losing 1 power plant. That asymmetry meant damage that guaranteed a kill on a Dornier, or a Junkers merely wounded a Lancaster. Night fighter crews needed either catastrophic structural damage or multiple engines out. A tall order when your firing window lasted 3 seconds. The Merlins themselves earned legend. Born for the Spitfire, these V-12 liquid-cooled engines delivered reliability that seemed supernatural. Lancasters routinely returned with engines that had eaten shrapnel, lost coolant, or blown cylinders, yet kept running. One famous case from 460 Squadron RAF in September 1943 saw Lancaster ED-860 return to Binbrook with the starboard inner destroyed, the crankcase shattered by flak. The Merlin still turned long enough to feather properly, and the remaining 3 brought the crew home across 400 miles of North Sea. But those 4 engines created a signature the designers did not intend. The Merlin's deep throb at cruise carried for miles on still nights. German sound locators, acoustic ranging posts along likely routes, could hear Lancaster streams before radar saw them. Worse, 4 engines meant 4 exhaust flame patterns. Despite later flame-damping shrouds, night fighter pilots learned to read the quartet of reddish glows from astern, especially during climbs when throttles were forward and exhaust temperatures peaked. The wingspan cut both ways. At 102 feet, the Lancaster offered a huge radar cross-section to the growing Liechtenstein, and later SN2 airborne intercept radars. Operators could distinguish Lancasters by the strength of the return. That big wing flashed like a billboard. By late 1943, crews even preferred hunting Lancasters over other types because they were easier to acquire. Suddenly, the barn nickname felt prescient, large enough to find, yet dangerous enough to make finding it irrelevant. Here is where fear crystallized. Easier to locate, easier to track, larger to hit, and still devastating at reaching targets. 4-engine redundancy meant successful interceptions often required multiple passes. Each pass increased exposure to the Lancaster's defenses. 8.303 Browning machine guns in dorsal and tail turrets, sometimes with a ventral gun added. More critically, each pass burned fuel while the bomber stream pressed on toward German cities. Night fighter pilots faced a brutal choice: engage the easier-to-find Lancaster and maybe score a kill after extended combat, or bypass it for softer targets, knowing that particular Lancaster would almost certainly drop. The Merlins enabled one more edge that German intelligence undervalued until too late. Lancasters could cruise near 200 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, throttle back to loiter around 180, or surge to about 240 when chased. That flexibility wrecked night fighter geometry built on predictable bomber speeds. Crews set up stern approaches based on closure rates, only to have the target accelerate or ease off, throwing deflection off and forcing dangerous corrections in the dark. The night of May 16, 1943, changed everything. Operation Chastise was not the largest raid, nor the most destructive by conventional measures, but it did something more valuable than level another factory district. It shattered German faith in their defenses and rewired how the Luftwaffe viewed the Lancaster. 19 specially modified Lancasters from 617 Squadron lifted from RAF Scampton, carrying Barnes-Wallis's cylindrical bouncing bombs, each about 9,250 pounds. The targets, the Möhne and Eder dams, were structures the Germans considered almost indestructible. The modifications showed the Lancaster's shocking adaptability: bomb bay doors removed, caliper arms to cradle a spinning mine. The weapon had to spin backward at about 500 revolutions per minute before release, driven by a hydraulic motor and belt run into the fuselage. Weight and height calculations were so critical that the standard bomb sight was replaced by a crude but brilliant trick: 2 spotlights angled to meet at exactly 60 feet above the water. When the pools touched, the height was perfect. German intelligence had never imagined that heavy bombers could be re-engineered so radically for a single mission. Wing Commander Guy Gibson led at treetop height, below radar, navigating by moonlight and landmarks. German defenses focused on high-altitude approaches. No one seriously considered that 4-engine bombers, weighing over 30 tons, could run at roughly 100 feet in darkness. That was not just tactical surprise. It was a redefinition of what heavy bombers could do, sliding beneath the entire defensive architecture. At 12:28 a.m., May 17th, Gibson's Lancaster released against the Möhne Dam. The mine skipped exactly as Wallace calculated, struck the wall, sank while still spinning, and detonated at depth. The first cracked, but did not breach. The second and third also failed to break through. Then, Flight Lieutenant Maltby's fifth weapon, at 12:49 a.m., collapsed the dam. Roughly 330 million tons of water tore through the gap, sending a wave about 25 feet high at nearly 15 miles per hour down the Ruhr Valley. Power stations drowned, factories flooded, rail lines washed away, and more than 1,200 people died. The Eder Dam fell 90 minutes later, after 3 weapons breached it, releasing another 200 million tons. Officials woke Albert Speer, the armaments minister, with the news. His first reaction, recorded in interrogation notes, was disbelief, then a chilling realization. If they can do this to dams, what else did we assume was safe? That question shadowed German planning for the rest of the war. The dams raid proved that British ingenuity plus Lancaster capability could hit targets once thought invulnerable. 8 Lancasters did not return from Operation Chastise, roughly 42% losses, unsustainable as a routine. But the propaganda value dwarfed the tactical metrics. Within days, reconnaissance photos of the breaches circulated among the Allies, while German papers struggled to explain the disaster. The Luftwaffe faced hard questions from Göring's staff. How had 19 bombers penetrated to the industrial heartland, attacked for almost 2 hours, and escaped with only moderate losses. The barn metaphor soured into something darker. These were not clumsy targets. They were precision platforms built to do the impossible. German countermeasures came fast and revealed deep worry. Low-level flak multiplied around critical sites. Searchlights were ordered to sweep low-altitude approaches. Anti-torpedo nets appeared on reservoirs and canals. Inland waters defended like naval bases. The Kriegsmarine diverted resources to protect dams as if they were capital ships. Every countermeasure admitted an uncomfortable truth. The Lancaster had abilities existing doctrine had not anticipated. More importantly, the psychological effect rippled through night fighter units. If Lancasters could attack at 100 feet with precision, what stopped them from doing it again? Night fighter tactics depended on altitude advantage and radar-guided intercepts between 15 and 22,000 feet. The dam's raid showed that Lancaster crews had the skill and nerve to operate in an envelope where German advantages vanished. Suddenly, the flying barn looked less like a liability and more like a threat that could appear at any altitude, at any hour, carrying weapons engineered to destroy whatever the British chose. The night sky over Germany between 1943 and 1945 hosted a lethal ballet that most people never witnessed, but thousands never survived. While the rest of Europe slept, Lancaster bombers and German night fighters fought in darkness so complete that combatants often never saw each other until tracers lit the void. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 and Junkers Ju 88 were Germany's primary counters to RAF night bombing, and their crews devised techniques to exploit Lancaster vulnerabilities. Yet the same crews increasingly filed reports of near misses, unexpected resistance, and the creeping recognition that hunting the flying barn carried costs other bombers did not impose. The Germans had turned night fighting into a science. By 1943, the Himmelbett system divided airspace over occupied Europe into boxes, each monitored by Würzburg radar stations that vectored assigned night fighters onto bomber streams. Once close, the fighter's own Liechtenstein radar took over, guiding the pilot to within visual distance, usually 200 yards, where skilled crews could identify types by silhouette. Feldwebel Wilhelm Suess, a radar operator with NJG-3, called the Lancaster's radar return unmistakable, wider and stronger than the Halifax, with a distinctive double reflection from the wings. Finding Lancasters was not the problem. Killing them efficiently was. The classic attack came from below and behind, exploiting a blind spot under the tail. British designers knew this vulnerability. Some Lancasters carried ventral turrets, but many were removed to save weight as bomb loads grew. The Bf 110 crew would settle roughly 100 feet low and 150 feet back, then pull up to bring nose guns to bear, 2 20mm cannons and 4 7.92 machine guns, for a 2-second burst into the belly, aiming at wing roots where fuel tanks clustered. In theory, a one-pass kill. Practice diverged when the target was a Lancaster. Hauptmann Martin Drews, with 52 night victories, noted in his August 1943 diary, "Lancasters absorb punishment differently. You see strikes, you see pieces fly, you are certain it is fatal." Then the aircraft continues, sometimes minutes, sometimes all the way to target and back. The fuel tanks have self-sealing better than intelligence suggested. The airframe is stronger. It is like shooting an ox instead of a horse. You need more bullets in more critical places. The summer of 1943 proved this during the Battle of Hamburg. Between July 24th and August 3rd, Bomber Command launched 4 major raids with more than 700 Lancasters among the total force. The RAF had just introduced window, clouds of aluminum strips to blind radar. Suddenly, the advantage flipped. Night fighters were forced back to moonlight, exhaust flames. and luck. In the chaos, with radar screens blizzarding with false returns, Lancaster formations pressed through with losses lower than expected. On the night of July 27th to 28th alone, 787 bombers attacked Hamburg, and only 17 were lost. About 2.2%, a rate German defenses were supposed to make impossible. Paul Zorner, later credited with 59 night victories, called the window raids a turning point. Before window, we had certainty. After window, we hunted by sight. The Lancasters seemed to know this made them less vulnerable. Their formations tightened. Their gunners grew aggressive. In August, I had 3 encounters where Lancaster tail gunners hit my aircraft before I could set a shot. These were not reactions. These were counterattacks. The Ju-88 brought a different trick. Schräge Musik, upward-firing cannons mounted behind the cockpit at roughly 70 degrees. The fighter could sit directly beneath a bomber, match speed, and fire upward into the fuselage without exposing itself. On paper, devastating to Lancasters. In practice, experienced Lancaster pilots used the corkscrew, a violent spiraling dive with rolls and direction changes that threw off even perfectly set attackers. Flight engineer accounts recall corkscrews so aggressive that loose equipment floated in brief zero gravity, then slammed into crew as the aircraft pulled through. By early 1944, German tactics had evolved around Lancaster specifics. Training emphasized multi-pass kills. Crews aimed to take out 2 engines on one wing to create uncontrollable yaw, to cut the tailplane and kill elevator control, or, in rare head-on passes, to kill the pilot outright. Each technique admitted a reality. Lancasters did not fold like Wellingtons or Stirlings. They demanded time and fuel to kill, exposing hunters to friendly flak, other bombers' fire, or RAF mosquito intruders. The predator-prey balance became uneasy. Contacts were common. Clean kills were fewer than expected. Lancaster crews knew that any mission could end in a 3-second burst from darkness. Yet they climbed into those perspex greenhouses night after night. Mutual fear was the most honest thing in the sky. The hunters feared the barn as much as the barn feared the hunters. The Lancaster's bomb bay measured 33 feet and stayed completely unobstructed, a feature that seemed ordinary until Barnes-Wallis calculated what could fit. By 1944, those calculations produced weapons so large that only the Lancaster could carry them, turning it from a general-purpose heavy bomber into a specialist for targets conventional ordnance couldn't touch. The Tallboy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs did not just expand capability. They created entirely new vulnerabilities for German infrastructure. Tallboy entered service in June 1944, weighing 12,000 pounds and running 21 feet long. Wallis designed it to penetrate earth or concrete before detonating, sending seismic shockwaves that shattered structures from within. The weapon required release from at least 18,000 feet to reach the needed terminal velocity, roughly 750 miles per hour at impact. No other Allied bomber combined payload and altitude performance to deliver Tallboy effectively. The Lancaster carried it externally, slung beneath the fuselage, giving an even more ungainly silhouette. German spotters learned to identify Tallboy carriers by the belly bulge, and those sightings triggered immediate alerts. Tallboy meant critical targets were about to receive special attention. The Saumur rail tunnel in the Loire Valley offered proof. On June 8th to 9th, 19 Lancasters of 617 Squadron attacked with Tallboys. One penetrated roughly 60 feet of earth and detonated under the tunnel, collapsing it so completely that German engineers never fully reopened the line. Reinforcements for Normandy were delayed along longer, poorer routes. Fewer than 20 precision strikes replaced what once demanded hundreds of sorties. The U-boat pens were an even clearer demonstration. At Brest, La Pallice, and other Atlantic ports, the Kriegsmarine built shelters with roofs up to 20 feet of reinforced concrete. They had shrugged off thousands of tons of bombs in 1941 to 1943. American daylight raids cratered the surroundings and lost dozens of B-17s. The pens endured. On August 6, 1944, Lancasters hit Brest with Tallboys. 5 direct hits punched through the roofs, something analysts had called impossible, collapsing internal structures and rendering the base useless. Albert Speer later told interrogators, "The U-boat pen attacks proved we had no sanctuary from British bombs, whatever concrete we poured." Then came Grand Slam, so absurd that German intelligence first dismissed reports as disinformation. The bomb weighed 22,000 pounds, more than 10 tons, and measured over 25 feet. A standard Lancaster could not carry it. Specially modified aircraft with strengthened gear, uprated engines and armor stripped were required. They sacrificed defensive guns and crew comfort to become single-weapon delivery trucks. The first operational use came March 14, 1945, against the Bielefeld Viaduct, a vital bridge that had survived multiple attacks. One Grand Slam struck near a base pillar. The earthquake effect collapsed about 100 yards of structure into rubble. Repair was impossible. The route was abandoned. What terrified defenders was not only size, but precision. Tallboy and Grand Slam needed accurate high-altitude release, typically 18 to 20,000 feet, to achieve the correct velocity and trajectory. That demanded advanced bomb sights, skilled bombardiers, and a stable platform. The Lancaster's automatic sight and steady high-altitude handling made it possible. Crews flew straight and level for 30 to 45 seconds on the run, making micro-corrections from the sight. Flak crews learned to dread those runs because Lancasters would not jink despite heavy fire. Accuracy meant taking hits rather than breaking off. Psychology amplified physics. Even a near miss from Tallboy or Grand Slam left an 80-foot deep, 100-foot wide crater. Workers heard the blast from miles away, felt the ground heave, and understood that any structure within a quarter mile could be annihilated by a single bomb. Morale reports in 1945 recorded widespread absenteeism after Grand Slam strikes. Workers refused to return because the British can collapse the entire factory with one bomb if they choose. Logistics confirmed the Lancaster's unique role. By early 1945, 617 and 9 squadrons acted as specialist units dedicated to Tallboy and Grand Slam. Bridges, viaducts, U-boat pens, V-weapon sites, targets conventional bombers could not truly damage, were assigned, and within days they ceased to exist. Precision destruction of hardened points had never before existed in military aviation. Factories could disperse, headquarters could move, supply dumps could hide, bridges could not. Submarine pens could not. With earthquake bombs, the Lancaster could reach any fixed thing and destroy it. The final irony lay in the arithmetic. A typical Lancaster raid might send 200 aircraft to drop 600 tons and achieve moderate damage to an industrial area. One Grand Slam delivered equivalent effect on a point target, risking one crew instead of 200. From the German perspective, that made the Lancaster even more frightening. You could not predict where the specialists would strike, could not defend against the penetration, and could not repair the damage. The Lancaster's operational statistics formed a paradox that confounded both Allied planners and German defenders. Between 1942 and 1945, Bomber Command lost 3,249 Lancasters to enemy action, roughly 43% of all built. The Halifax lost about 34%, the older Sterling nearly 50% before withdrawal. By those figures, the Lancaster was moderately dangerous to crew, neither safest nor deadliest. Yet it flew 156,000 sorties and dropped 608,612 tons, more than any other British bomber by a huge margin. The math produced a strange psychology. German defences destroyed many Lancasters, but never enough to matter. Losses swung wildly by target and conditions. In the disastrous Nuremberg raid of March 30th to 31st, 1944, Bomber Command dispatched 795 aircraft, including 572 Lancasters. Clear weather and bright moon favoured defenders. 95 bombers did not return, 71 of them Lancasters, about 12.4% for the type, far above the 5% Bomber Command called sustainable. Weeks later, Lancaster raids ran with losses under 2%. Survivability depended more on tactics, weather, routing, and defensive saturation than on inherent toughness. What set the Lancaster apart was not invulnerability, but the capacity to sustain operations despite losses. Avro's Chadderton line and shadow factories produced Lancasters faster than they were destroyed. In 1943 alone, Britain built 2,126, while losses totaled 1,046. Even at peak intensity, Lancaster strength grew month by month. German Order of Battle analysts watched Lancaster squadron strength rise from 44 operational aircraft in January 1942 to more than 700 by January 1944. No matter how many they shot down, more arrived. Crew experience added a human layer. A Lancaster crew faced about 44% odds of death and roughly 12% of capture over a standard 30-operation tour. Fewer than half completed tours unscathed. Flight engineer Norman Ashton of 467. Squadron RAF later said, "You knew the numbers. You watched aircraft fail to return. You saw new crews arrive and vanish in weeks. But you also knew some survived, and you told yourself you would be among them." What else could you do? By mid-1943, this grim math was common knowledge, yet volunteers filled billets faster than attrition could empty them. The Lancaster's habit of limping home with horrific damage fed confidence, even as overall losses stayed severe. Debrief photos show Lancasters with great sections torn away, tailplanes shredded, engines destroyed, still flying. Lancaster ED-888, Admiral Prune, completed 140 operations between 1942 and 1945, a record that mocked probability. Each story of a Lancaster surviving the impossible reinforced a belief that skill and luck might beat the odds. The aircraft earned a reputation for toughness, and that mattered, even if the statistics argued otherwise. For German planners, the paradox became a resource crisis. Night fighter units and flak batteries destroyed 40 to 50 Lancasters per month through 1943 and 1944, numbers that should have degraded British capability. Instead, Lancaster raids intensified. Tonnage increased. Accuracy improved as experience and new technology accumulated. Luftwaffe commanders were trapped in an unwinnable equation. Tactical victories piled up, while the strategic campaign slipped away because British industry and training pipelines outpaced attrition. Every Lancaster downed was a victory. That added up to defeat. Sustainability reached beyond production into training and doctrine. Bomber Command built a system that could absorb 44% losses while maintaining tempo. Heavy conversion units trained replacement crews constantly, with combat-experienced instructors passing on hard lessons. New crews arrived knowing Lancaster systems, tactics, and procedures. By 1944, replacements could become operational within weeks of joining a squadron. Force strength held. despite ongoing losses. The psychological implications were not lost on German defenders. A flak crew might drop a Lancaster in flames one night, then face 50 more a week later. Individual triumphs brought no reassurance because the bomber stream kept coming. Propaganda struggled to make defensive victories meaningful. Announcing 20 British bombers destroyed sounded impressive until citizens asked why their city was still bombed. High losses plus high tempo created a sense of unstoppable momentum that raw numbers couldn't convey. Post-war accounting sharpened the point. Despite losing nearly half of all built, Lancasters delivered 2/3 of Bomber Command's total tonnage. Destruction per aircraft lost favored the Lancaster. On average, each lost Lancaster had flown more sorties and dropped more bombs than Halifaxes, Stirlings or others. Vulnerable, yet effective. Mortal, yet mission-capable. Feared by crews, relied upon by commanders who lacked a better tool. The most compelling evidence of German fear does not come from propaganda, but from unguarded words captured in Allied interrogations. These transcripts, declassified decades later, reveal a pattern. German air crews respected American daylight raids for precision and fighter cover, but they dreaded Lancaster night attacks for reasons rooted in exhaustion. Oberst Werner Streib, with 65 confirmed kills, told interrogators in May 1945, "Fighting the Americans was combat, dangerous but comprehensible. Fighting the Lancasters at night was hunting ghosts that burned your cities while you hunted them." Dulag Luft records include many references to Lancaster capability from the German side. 1 November 1943 document notes a conversation between Hauptmann Josef Kammhuber and several night fighter pilots. Asked which bomber they would avoid if given the choice, the unanimous answer was Lancaster formations, specifically large streams. Pilots explained that Halifax groups were smaller and less concentrated. Stirlings flew lower and slower. American B-17s came by day on known routes. Lancasters came at night in hundreds, spread across wide areas with unpredictable routing, and maintained momentum regardless of losses. Captured home defense reports echo the frustration. A Flakgruppe Frankfurt paper from February 1944 states, "Lancaster formations maintain altitude and speed through barrage concentrations that disperse other types. Our predictive fire assumes normal evasive reactions. Lancaster pilots often hold course despite bracketing, presumably prioritizing accuracy over survival. This yields lower hit probabilities than calculated." The report then requests increased ammunition specifically for Lancaster raids. Civilian industry voices add texture. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey recorded August Schmidt, a shift supervisor at Krupp in Essen. Early in the war, sirens meant concern, not terror. By 1943, when the Lancasters came in strength, everything changed. You knew they would find the factory. You knew the bombs would hit. The sound of their engines, that deep rumble of hundreds approaching, was worse than the explosions because it meant hours of attack. That acoustic signature appears again and again. Unlike the higher-pitched buzz of daylight radial engines, Lancaster streams produced a low throb that penetrated buildings and shelters. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, civilians reported hearing formations for 10 to 15 minutes before bombs fell. A dread that stretched nerves to breaking. Sound-ranging posts noted Lancaster noise carried farther than expected, perhaps due to the resonance of 4 synchronized Merlins. The advance warning paradoxically made raids more terrifying. Internal Luftwaffe memos show strategic anxiety. General der Flieger Hans-Jürgen Stumpf, commanding Luftflotte Reich in late 1944, wrote that while American daylight raids drew more political attention, the sustained night offensive by Lancaster forces was the greater threat to production and morale. American raids are surgical and can be defended by concentration. Lancaster attacks are sledgehammer blows distributed in patterns that defeat concentration. He urged shifting night fighter resources from the coast to target area defense, admitting that stopping streams before they arrived had largely failed. Top aces confirmed the respect. Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, with 121 victories, later described Lancaster formations as professionally flown by crews who understood survival depended on mutual support and discipline. You could not easily pick off stragglers. Rear gunners were alert and aggressive. Most importantly, the Lancasters kept coming regardless of losses. We might shoot down 20 in a night. 2 nights later, just as many came again. Late war interrogations of younger personnel show a different tone. Resignation. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, captured after bailing out over Holland in March 1945, said, "They came every week, sometimes several times a week. You stopped thinking about individual raids and started thinking about the siege. Your city under constant threat, your sleep broken, your family never safe." The Lancaster was not just an aircraft. It was a symbol that we could not protect our homeland. Post-war debriefings of senior commanders for the Strategic Bombing Survey highlight the same theme. Asked which Allied methods were most effective, several cited the psychological weight of sustained Lancaster night attacks. General Feldmarschall Erhard Milch stated, "The Americans hurt our production with precision. The British, with Lancasters, broke the will of workers who could not sleep, could not feel safe, and could not keep productivity under constant night bombardment. Both were effective. The Lancaster campaign was more corrosive to morale. The Lancaster's combat career ended in May 1945, but its transformation from derided target to legendary weapon had already reshaped strategic thought. When the first Lancasters entered service in early 1942, conventional wisdom said heavy bombers needed heavy defensive guns, high-altitude performance, and precision sights to survive by day. The Americans built the B-17 and B-24 around that idea. The Lancaster followed a different philosophy. Maximize payload, accept moderate defensive armament, operate at night in concentrated streams, overwhelm defenses with numbers and persistence. By war's end, that approach proved devastatingly effective despite defying doctrine. The numbers tell the story. Lancaster squadrons flew 156,000 sorties and dropped 608,612 tons while losing 3,249 aircraft. The Halifax flew 75,532 sorties, dropped 227,610 tons, and lost 1,833. The Lancaster flew more than double the sorties and nearly triple the tonnage, with roughly 80% higher losses. Efficiency, tons per aircraft lost, favored the Lancaster. On average, each Lancaster lost had delivered about 187 tons before destruction. Each Halifax managed about 124. The Sterling, withdrawn from main force operations by 1944, managed roughly 89. The barn proved itself a workhorse that justified its casualties through output. Doctrine shifted accordingly. Post-war U.S. designs borrowed Lancaster principles. The B-36 Peacemaker emphasized a huge bay for single massive weapons, including nuclear, rather than maximum gun turrets. The B-52 Stratofortress continued that evolution, prioritizing payload and range over defensive guns. By the 1960s, heavy bombers had largely abandoned the flying fortress concept for the Lancaster's payload-first philosophy. The barn won the argument. Adaptability mattered as much as raw power. Beyond standard bombing, Lancasters performed maritime patrol, electronic warfare, photographic reconnaissance, and later nuclear test monitoring. Modified Lancasters dropped the first 12,000-pound bombs, the first 22,000-pound bombs, and pioneered low-level marking that revolutionized target identification. They served with RAF Coastal Command hunting U-boats, operated in the Middle East and Far East, and continued in varied roles until final retirement in 1963, 18 years after the war. Few military aircraft matched that longevity and breadth. The human cost sits at the core. Of roughly 125,000 aircrew who served in Bomber Command, 55,573 were killed, about 44%, a rate higher than British infantry in percentage terms. Lancaster crews made up the majority of those losses from 1942 onward. They volunteered knowing the odds, climbed into unheated aircraft at -40 degrees, and flew through flak and night fighter fire that killed at random. Their casualty rate approached that of U-boat crews, another service where probability favored death. The Lancasters' effectiveness rested on their willingness to face those odds again and again. German cities bore physical proof for decades. Hamburg, where firestorms in July 1943 killed more than 40,000 people, kept bombed-out shells into the 1960s. Dresden's reconstruction stretched into the 1990s. Cologne's cathedral stood over a sea of rubble, a testament to selective survival amid comprehensive destruction. Whether these attacks were military necessity, war crimes, or something between remains debated. What is not debated is that the Lancaster made such scale possible. The nickname that began as mockery ended as acknowledgement. Post-war Luftwaffe memoirs speak of Lancasters with respect, bordering on reverence, the way fighter pilots speak of worthy foes. The barn metaphor faded from German accounts by 1944, replaced by clinical Viermotorig, Britische Bomber, four-engine British bombers, stripped of earlier disdain. Language mirrored reality. By late war, German defenses adapted specifically to counter Lancaster tactics, developing methods and technologies focused on the aircraft that dominated RAF bomber streams. The barn became the primary threat, not an amusing sideshow. The final Lancaster sorties flew on April 25, 1945, dropping food to starving Dutch civilians in Operation Manna. Thousands of Lancasters made low passes over Holland, bomb bays filled with flour, chocolate, and tinned meat instead of explosives. Civilians who had spent years sheltering from those same aircraft now watched them deliver salvation. That near-instant transformation, from strategic bomber to humanitarian lifter, captured the Lancaster's core adaptability. The aircraft could be whatever the mission demanded, whether destroying cities or feeding refugees. Preserved airframes speak to the legacy. Only two remain airworthy, one in Britain, one in Canada, and both draw immense crowds at air shows. The sound of 4 Merlins at full power triggers instant recognition for anyone who knows aviation history. Museums across the Commonwealth display static Lancasters. Veterans groups fund restorations. Sustained public interest, 8 decades later, suggests the Lancaster transcended hardware to become a symbol of British persistence, Allied determination, or the industrial capacity to wage total war. The strategic bombing campaign the Lancaster enabled remains controversial because it succeeded. Had Bomber Command failed to damage production or morale, historians might dismiss it as a costly diversion. Instead, it degraded industry, tied down hundreds of thousands in defense, and forced resources homeward rather than to the front. These effects cost 55,573 Allied aircrew lives and hundreds of thousands of German civilian lives. The Lancaster made the exchange possible. Whether it made it justifiable remains an open question each generation answers differently. What is beyond question is that the flying barn earned its fearsome reputation by results. not propaganda. German crews called it a barn because it looked vulnerable, then learned it was lethal. They shot down thousands. Thousands more came. They built countermeasures that reduced effectiveness but never stopped the raids. They respected it, feared it, and in the end could not defeat it. The nickname stayed, but the meaning transformed, from insult to inadvertent tribute to an aircraft that refused to be anything other than what it was designed to be. A weapon delivery platform that prioritized its mission over everything else, including the survival of those who flew it. In the calculus of total war, that single-minded purpose proved devastatingly effective.